How is Soul Calibur affected by timelines and other theories? Part 1. Hey, what's up guys, it's Yoon, and today I'm bringing another hopefully exciting video. So what I got for you today is a 3-part series discussing the differences and their occurrences in relation to Soul Calibur pertaining to quantum relativity. So this is going to be in bite-sized tidbits so it's easy for everyone to understand. I'm going to show diagrams and I'm going to actually discuss not only how they work in science but also how they work theoretically and colloquially and within fiction, which is usually like movies, comics, and stuff like that, because it's very different across all 3 mediums. So let's begin. Alright, today we were talking about part 1. So what I wanted to discuss today is actually timelines. Okay, so timelines being the most affected thing in the Soul Calibur universe because we are starting a new timeline. So when it comes to timelines, it's a little bit different than other multiversal theories such as, a multiverse or alternate dimensions, things of that nature. So we're going to talk about it in base terms first, and then we're going to talk about it how it pertains to Soul Calibur, and then we're going to talk about how it's mentioned colloquially. And if you don't know, colloquially just means in modern everyday talk, like the word theory, for example. Theory in science is the height of pretty much knowledge. It just means it's basically a fact. It just means that it's gone through all the rigorous testings that it needs to. It has not been falsified. It predicts future events, it predicts models, and it actually adheres to them mathematically and in real time. This pretty much just means that in science, a theory is basically a fact. Science doesn't hold any objectivity to a fact because everything can change with new knowledge and new information. So theory pretty much means fact in science without actually meaning fact. Now, colloquially, a theory like this means that it is an idea or a hypothesis. So I would say, so in science, if you would take the term, this works good in theory, right? This would mean that according to the mathematical model that predicted the outcome, it actually adhered to all of the possibilities without breaking down, and it met its criteria and predictions without actually being falsified. Short story short, it means their guess was true. So in colloquialism, you would say I have a theory on that, which pretty much means a guess or a hypothesis. So they're just a little example of 2 different things, how colloquialism is totally different from how it's actually used in academia or scientific circles. So to start off with this, when we're talking about timelines, if we're going to talk about the scientific version of a timeline or what a timeline actually is, that is just a chain of events that start from point A and stretch out forth. So you can think about a dot, which would be a beginning, and then a straight line, and then an arrow at the end of that straight line, and that would be a timeline, okay? Completely linear, no changes or modifications, that would be one timeline. Now, in Soul Calibur, we're talking about the new timeline, right? Because a lot of people go back and forth when it comes to Soul Calibur 1 through 5, and now 6 going forward, and they'll say, well, this happened in this, and this happened in that, and this happened in that. When it comes to reboots and soft reboots and things of that nature, obviously retcons, people get confused, and it's really easy to get confused, especially if you're a fan of comic books or movies. You can see how things happen. The best way that I can talk about divergent timelines or timelines that actually are branching timelines, we can look at the series Loki from Marvel on Disney+, where you have one action that happens on the linear timeline, and that action causes a branching decision, which causes an entirely new parallel timeline. Now, usually these timelines go on together, parallel to each other. One universe exists here, and another universe is created in which that decision was made or wasn't made, or a different decision was made. So we have multiple possibilities from one action point, and every single one of those going forward affects different things. Now, how would this be relative to Soul Calibur? Well, it's been stated in Soul Calibur that everything that happened in Soul Edge and Soul Blade that has said to have happened has actually happened, and everything therefore going forward is completely susceptible to change. This means any kind of actionable events or any kind of actionable process or progress within that timeline, branching or otherwise. The linear timeline is going to go forward regardless. Now, this can mean a multitude of different facets, and it doesn't just affect actions within the timeline, because that goes into branching multiversal theory, which basically states that if a universe makes a decision, or somebody within a said closed universe makes a decision, it branches into multiple paths. The first path being what happened if they made the decision, second path being if they did not make the decision, third path being if they made an alternate decision. So if we're going to say, like, Tommy proposed to Cindy, and we have three different options, right? So we have Cindy said yes, in which this timeline is created, in which Cindy and the dude get married, and then we have a divergent timeline in which she said no, which is equally existent, which means that there's this now timeline where she said no and they don't get married. You know, everybody that changes that their mind, or these effects that happen, branches forward into, it's a crazy amount of strings, how many like umpteen strings this could happen. Something major like that would be perhaps like someone being born that affects the timeline in the future for the good or the bad, or for the null, or for whether or not those people in that timeline actually come into existence. That changes everything from the future, and that's on a macro scale. On a micro scale, it's something as small as like Timmy decided to not have a cup of coffee in the morning, therefore he was 3 minutes early to work. He accidentally stepped on a butterfly that's now not going to give birth to a bunch of other butterflies. That's not going to affect its ecosystem. Like literally a little tiny decision, like even whether you blink or not, right, can branch off into multiple times. And this is mind-blowing. I know, like, this is even in layman's terms. I'm trying to do it as easily digestible as possible. But how it relates to most fictional canons is when a divergent timeline is created, it's usually because something bad or good happens that needs to be changed. So if you see in Avengers, they went back in time so that they can fix the snap, right? Undo the snap. So we have everything that happened in that timeline still happening parallel to them going back in that timeline. That's why you see like 2 Captain Americas, 2 Lokis, yada yada. Now, in regular physics, there's a bunch of hypotheses whether this is actually possible, if 2 things of the same space can actually fit in the same space at the same time, because time and space run together and they exist together. Meaning that, like, you could cause like some kind of like catastrophic anomaly if like 2 things are in the same place at once. We've seen this explored in multiple different theories and things throughout time. But without getting too much confuddled with that, what we basically have is the timeline where this happened, the timeline where this didn't happen, going back to that point and making it where the timeline changed to go to which one or the other. Now, it's a little confusing here because it shows that everything exists in the same plane of existence. So this timeline is still happening while this timeline is happening. Just the difference is the perspective or shift of focus. You can see a lot of this in comics and TVs and movies all the time. But if we're talking about it in simplest terms, when one timeline begins and one timeline ends, that's different from a branching timeline. So when we have a timeline beginning and a timeline ending, or a timeline beginning and going forward and not being focused on, that means that everything that happened in this past does not happen in this current timeline. So a lot of people will correlate this to Soul Calibur by saying, well, it happened in this timeline, so therefore it's going to happen in this timeline. But again, as I said, every little tiny decision and minute detail that's made within both timelines completely branches off and changes things. Now, there is actually a lot of other like fixations that you can like focus on, but when it comes down to basics in Soul Calibur, it would be like everything that happened in Soul Calibur and Soul Blade and Soul Edge happened if it said it happened. And then going forward, we have this timeline. Now, everything obviously is different from this timeline that happened in the last timeline, because clearly in Soul Calibur 1, we didn't have any focus on like Grow or the Evolve organization or Aswell or anything like that. Now, this does lean more into Soul Calibur Season 2 writing being awesome, but also a little bit sloppy, because what they do is they're going from timeline to a little bit of quantum or universal theory, and that totally is mixing up whatever they're trying to say. we're going to get into that in another part of the video, which is going to be broken up into 3 videos. So I just want to focus on timelines. Let's just focus on this. So say that in the first part of the timeline, let's put this in an example that most people commonly use. We're going to talk about Pyrrha and Patroclus, okay? So a lot of people will say that, like, oh, well, if Sophia has her kids again in this timeline, it's going to be Pyrrha and Patroclus. This is actually completely not true. Literarily, it could possibly make an effect. They could rename the characters the same, even though we saw like a different name being used, which I know the name is the Greek name of the, I believe, husband of Pyrrha. So like they're trying to say that like they are using similar natures, but they're Greek, so they're going to use that kind of stuff anyway. When it comes to those 2 characters, we have something that's called like the Punel chart, and I'm going to discuss this in today's video, but it also is affected to all the rest of this week's videos. So the Punel chart is just stating that when you have 2 lines of code, they can mix into infinitum, which means that there is a near infinite possibility of recombinations of the DNA and the gametes and all that, the structures within like the genetic code itself, the genetic markers, which ones are activated, which ones are not. And we're talking about just people. This happens in everything from every form of life that's on the planet. So if you have 2 parents and they get together and they make a child, they're taking 50% of their genetic code and 50% of their genetic code and mixing it together. But what genes are specifically activated and what recombinations of genetic structure are actually happening is what makes the individual come from that. So you can have, let's say me and my wife have a child. It's up to almost complete random chance which genes are activated, what's carried on and passed on, and that child will be different determinal based on which genetic structures are seen. The easiest way to compare this is if you have brothers and sisters, you're both 50% genetic code of your parents, but you're not exactly the same. You're not direct clones of your parents because there was a genetic recombination and reconfiguration that went on at the point of genetic markers being activated. So you, although being similar and made up of the same DNA, are completely different from one another unless you have twins or triplets or something that's anomalous like that. So you can see where I'm going with this. Like every decision you make, every thing that affected you in the timeline prior, like since it's just a recombination and a reconfiguration and it's completely at random and chance, there's no control over what gets activated and what doesn't. So let's say that me and my wife have a child in this timeline and it turns out this way. If we have the same child in another timeline, it may be completely different with completely different genetic markers being activated, meaning they may look different, sound different, feel different, act different. They'd be a completely different person. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference if you had the 2 people next to each other, just based on the random chance of that time happening. So in this timeline, if Sophia is having her kids, they are going to be completely different from the last timeline just based on random chance alone. Not even talking about the actions that actually occurred in this timeline to get this version of Sophia to this point. It's a really complicated thing, and hopefully I did a good job of like explaining it in basic terms. If you have any questions about this, just please feel free to let me know in the comment section down below and I can explain it to you further. Also, I will open this up for discussion on my Discord so that it's a lot easier for us to have group conversations based upon this. I am going to be talking about in tomorrow's video, we're going to be getting into a little bit different versions of that. Like today we talked about timelines. Tomorrow we're actually going to be talking about like parallel universes and multiverses, and then we're going to finish it off with how this all relates to Soul Calibur on Friday. But thank you guys for watching, and I hope you give this video a thumbs up for me trying my best to explain this, and it would make me happy if you subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. My goal for this year is to get to 2,222 subscribers, so only you guys can really make that happen. Any and all thoughts are always welcome in the comment section down below, and as I always say, I love it. Thank you.
And thank you.